Good afternoon. Welcome to Critical Considerations when Transitioning from Traditional to Interactive Digital Signage, a webinar hosted by Digital Signage Today. I'm Bradley Cooper. I'm the editor of Digital Signage Today, and I'll be moderating today's discussion with Jeff Besson, who is the Chief Evangelist at Intuiface. Traditionally, non-interactive signage has dominated the market, but that has started to change due to dropping costs and complexities. Today, Jeff will be discussing tactics on how to convert traditional signage into interactive experiences. Please feel free to submit questions anytime during the presentation, which will be answered during the live Q&A immediately following the presentation. With that, I'll pass the mic off to Jeff.
Bradley, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone else. Thank you so much for joining. I'm super excited for this webinar. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I hope I have a lot of interesting things to share. If I may just briefly introduce myself. Again, I am Jeff Besson with Intuiface. My title is Chief Evangelist, which is a funky title that basically means it's my job to speak with our customers, our prospects, our partners, other thought leaders to really get a handle on what it means to create, deploy, measure, and manage interactive content as effectively as possible. Our company is a software vendor. It produces software, the same name, Intuiface. It's used by teams around the world to create interactive content without coding. We have over 1,500 customers, which is a lot of opportunity over the past now 7-8 years of our software being out in the world. It's a lot of opportunity to learn from their experiences in how best to tackle this transition. Because let's face it, all of us have created traditional content of some kind. Be it signage or not, we've all made a slide, right? We've all written a Word doc. These are traditional means of parlaying information to an audience. We've all been there. We have not, perhaps most of us have not had lots of experience in creating and distributing interactive content, in particular, interactive signage. Through a lot of interviews, a lot of experience over the years, as well as just building our own software, I think we've been able to narrow it down to 8 critical considerations when you start thinking about that transition from traditional to interactive digital signage, and that's what we'll talk about today. I think it's best that to get started, we need to define some terms. I don't want to assume that you know what I'm talking about or that you share the same definitions I do. So let's get on the same page. First, what do we mean by interactivity? What's interactivity? Well, the obvious definition is touch, right? That's probably typically what we think of when we think of interactivity. That's fingers on a screen. Could be a screen you hold, could be table mounted, could be on a wall, it could be a single display, could be a multi-screen display. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, there's a screen, there's one or more fingers, and you're touching, tapping, swiping, spreading, that sort of thing. The nice thing about touch is it's fairly universal. You know, even 10 years ago, you could have argued that older demographics just didn't have a good comfort level using the iPhone or something like this. These days, I think it's fairly safe to say that most folks are comfortable with the paradigm. They know what it means to interact with a screen. There's a general understanding of what particular gestures mean, like a spread or a pinch or a swipe. It's kind of universal. So it's a universal interactive language, and there's a lot to be said for that. There are some downsides as well, but we'll get to that in a moment. However, when I talk about interactivity, I don't just mean touch. It's what we naturally think of, so let me define the rest of interactivity as beyond touch. Still interaction, though. Could be beacon technology or RFID NFC. Could be the Internet of Things. This is more of a system-to-system interaction, right? But there's still interaction here. Voice or sensors for things like motion or light or temperature. Demographics, this is where you're using the camera to identify gender or ballpark an age or an emotion. QR codes are a type of interaction, aren't they? Because it's enabling people at the screen to take things with them. The screen has interacted with the user and gave them a URL. Even things like web triggers, where one piece of software is talking to another one, facilitated over the internet, okay? All of these human-machine or machine-to-machine interactions fall underneath this umbrella that we call interactivity. And for sure, particularly if you're an agency or an integrator, but really anybody with the ambition of creating modern and engaging interactive digital signage, you are hamstringing yourself if you only think about touch, because there's many more options out there, and software like Intuiface has lowered the bar to adoption. You should be considering these things. They may be active, they may be passive, meaning active is initiated by a human being where they have expressed their intent or their desire. Others are passive. Maybe it's based on motion, maybe it's based on the time of day, where it's not explicitly a human-initiated event, but still important to make that engagement sticky and meaningful for the audience. All of these things need to be considered. So if we take this current definition of interactivity, touch plus beyond touch, I'm curious. I would like to know, before we go deep into the details, what percentage of your current projects incorporate interactivity today? Now, if you're an agency or an integrator, you know what I mean by a project. But even if you're not, you're a sales or marketing team, maybe you're in retail, still, try to gauge for me what percentage of your work currently incorporates interactivity. And I'll give you a couple seconds to dial that up. This is anonymous, by the way, so nobody's going to see what anybody else answered. See a lot of numbers rolling in. I'll give you 5 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Thank you, guys. Thanks for that. So there's a little bias towards the low end, and then the nice little spike at the high end as well. We have a good distribution, which I think is a perfect audience. So thank you for that information. I want to push the definition of interactivity even further. I didn't want to give you this definition before the poll, but I do think it's important to expand the definition of interactivity a little bit further, which is to think about data. Okay, because as we will discover when we talk about critical considerations, another key element to ensuring your interactive signage is engaging and effective is to personalize it, to make it personally meaningful for the audience and not generic. To do that, you almost have to have some sort of data resource connected to that screen, some level of connectivity to drive that interaction using data. That is also interactivity, because we're talking about interacting with web services or other third-party APIs, could be .NET DLLs, JavaScript applications, some facilitator connecting your screen to some back-office business logic, maybe a connected object amongst the Internet of Things. So any kind of app, any kind of device out in the cloud, this type of interaction is also more and more crucial to ensure the effectiveness of your deployment. So I'm going to include this in my definition of interactivity so we're all on the same page. You need to consider the personalization aspect just as much as you do the type of interaction to ensure it's effective. So, okay, now that we have our definition, let's do a little contrast here, because the title of this webinar is Contrasting Traditional from Interactive, that transition. So how do we contrast these two? So typically for traditional signage, it's formulaic content distribution. You create a schedule, right? There's a schedule. And the schedule might vary based on screens, but it's still a formula. These screens have this schedule, those screens have that schedule. And so this is not a judgment, but it's saying there's schedules there. For a truly interactive, modern interactive signage deployment, it's human-driven content distribution. They're choosing what they want to see. You're not making a guess. You're not scheduling a video, you're letting the user decide what they want to see and what they want to do. And maybe you're driving them down a path, you're steering them in a certain direction. There is a goal for that deployment, but you're letting the human, well, I guess it could be animals. I don't want to be humanist here, but typically humans, right, are driving that content distribution. For traditional signage, it's typically, traditionally, independent of who's at the screen. Now, there is some movement these days to use passive interaction to bring some personalization to traditional signage, like the demographic-based work off of a camera. So it's passive. The person at the screen hasn't said, I'm a 30-year-old female. You're passively collecting that information and using it in the signage. But traditionally, it's the same content for all viewers, right? Whereas the whole point of interactivity is to personalize. Okay, so now maybe I'm beating the dead horse already, but here it is not the same for all viewers. The point is for it not to be the same for all viewers, right? Third, for traditional signage, it tends to be a poor data collection resource for analytics. If you're going to run a business, you're probably going to want to measure something to ensure your business is being run effectively, right? There are certain metrics you need to collect. Theoretically, you should do that for any kind of business endeavor, is measure stuff. How am I doing? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And is there something I can do to improve it? And the fact is, for traditional signage, there really aren't many things you can measure, right? Typically, at best, it's secondary measures, and we know correlation doesn't mean causation. Interactivity, on the other hand, is perfect for analytics. Its whole job is to capture the preferences of the audience and give them what they want. You can collect that information. But it's not just about what products they put in their shopping cart or what videos that they decide to watch. If you have true data-driven connectivity, you can collect any information accessible to the device. And a simple example would be, what did people look at on my endless aisle kiosk on a rainy day? What did they look at on a sunny day? Well, you can't tell from inside the store if it's rainy or sunny. That information is to come from someplace else. But if you have solved the data connectivity issue, you can bring in all of this contextual information, which may very well influence the decisions made by your target audience. You might be missing some influencer if you're not collecting this contextual information. So that's one of the beauties of interactivity. You're rolling in data. And we're going to talk about analytics a little bit later because, of course, rolling in data doesn't mean insight. You have to do something with that data. But clearly there's an advantage there if you want to do something measurable, if for no other reason, for return on investment. So why do interactivity? Now, I have to believe that the majority of you are here because you already have a compelling reason to at least consider it. But if I may briefly, why consider interactivity? Well, for the end user, for the business, right? For the people, the realtor, for the museum, for the whatever, whoever's sign that is. The advantage of interactivity is to increase engagement and increase conversion. It is not rocket science to understand that passive displays that don't involve interactivity likely convert and engage at a lower rate than interactive content would do. I think that's pretty obvious. We can debate the numbers, and of course, a great sign will outperform a horrible interactive screen, right? But relatively speaking, for sure, if you want to have engagement at all, let alone increase, but increase engagement, have better conversion rates, you really need to consider interactivity. If you're an agency or an integrator, there's tons of opportunity. Everybody has seen Minority Report, right, and Tom Cruise, and that always kind of comes up. But I think still for the most part, the world believes interactivity is this very complicated, niche sort of thing that only very rich companies can do, and it's just not the case. And as the word gets out and as you promote your business, you're going to find there's enormous opportunity. There will always be a place for traditional signage, for non-interactive signage. There will always be a place. But increasingly, more and more interactivity is where it's at. So the opportunity is enormous. The question is if you can somehow, get your hands on that. And the other would be differentiation. The traditional methods of tackling things like interactivity could be a lot of bespoke development, kind of hardcore work, and not every agency or integrator can do that. But however you do it, for sure it's a way to differentiate, because most companies still aren't there yet for whatever reason. So whether you're the end user or you're producing content for a client, there's significant opportunity here. All right, there's my preamble. Now it's time to talk about the critical considerations. We're on the same page about interactivity. We understand it means not just touch, but multiple types of interaction, both active and passive. We understand the advantages of adopting interactivity in contrast to traditional non-interactive signage, and maybe some incentive to go there. Let's say you're thinking about going there. You're convinced. What are those critical considerations? This is why we're here, right? So there are 8. At a high level, this is the order we're going to move through. The 8 considerations when transitioning from traditional to interactive signage. The first is suitability for interaction. Not every sign should be interactive. Okay, so I'm not claiming otherwise. So the first consideration is, how suitable is my business goal for this deployment to interaction? The second is location and demographics. You need to consider these things when designing your interactive signage, thinking about content, thinking about even things like hardware, that sort of thing. The third, privacy and security. We're going to dive into that a little bit. The considerations you need to have if at any point you are personalizing that experience, what do you need to think about? The fourth is accessibility. This is about accommodating anyone in the audience with a physical impairment. That doesn't just mean wheelchair or something like this. Maybe they just are colorblind, or they have a little trouble hearing, or whatever, right? So it could be anywhere along the spectrum. This is a very serious consideration. The fifth is design influencers. So these are a little bit about sort of best practices for interactive content. It's a new paradigm. It's not building a web page. Web pages are bad resources for interactive screens. There are different things you need to consider when building something for an interactive milieu, and we'll talk about some of those. Sixth is personalization. So that's that big item about how do you make content relevant to the particular user. What do you need to think about if you want to make it a personalized experience? 7, analytics. I already harped on that. We'll dive into analytics a bit more later. And then finally, implementation approach. How are you going to create this sign, this interactive content? What approach are you going to take? And there's lots of things you can consider. Really meaty topic. That's why I was excited about talking on this subject. Let's go. So first, suitability for interaction. In other words, what is the project objective and what will be the measure of success? You need to think about, would personalization improve project success? I am not telling you that the answer is always yes. It is not true that it will always be better. Here's a dumb example. An exit sign doesn't need to be interactive and personalized, unless you want to create some funky exit sign exhibit, I guess. But or if you're running a sale in a particular store department, or if you want to promote certain exhibits at a museum, there may be no advantage to personalizing it. So maybe you shouldn't bother. And even if it would make sense, is it possible? If you do not have access to the data, maybe it exists, but you don't have access to it, or it doesn't even exist. There is no data. It's not available. Well, then it would be hard to personalize it anyway. I would argue it depends on how you define personalization. So if maybe it's just male versus female, well, you could personalize that even if the information is not accessible. But it does mean you're also investing in the hardware to purchase the camera and then the underlying software infrastructure to identify the gender. And so there's an additional overhead there, which is cost. Right? But by and large, the big consideration for personalization is, can you even get to that data to begin with? Then you need to think about measures of success. Ideally, you're not investing in any signage project, whether it's interactive or not, without some understanding of the point. Why are we doing this? Right? So when you have that objective, it's then how are you going to measure the level of achievement of that objective? right? You should be doing this anyway, but if you're considering interactivity, we discussed why interactivity is valuable for analytics, but you do need to think about, can I get the data I'm going to need to figure out if I'm on track to achieve my objective, right? What do I need to do? Because by going through this thought process, you might uncover certain things you need to do that you may not have thought of otherwise. Things you need to do purely to ensure you can get the information you need to identify how well you're progressing towards your objective, right? You need to do this up front before you invest in the hardware and in the software, because you might uncover things that you would not have considered. And if you consider this after the investment, it might be too late, right? So what is the objective? Is it suitable for interaction? How are we going to measure our ability to achieve those objectives? And how would I use interactivity to facilitate that? Could I use interactivity to facilitate that? Then you need to think about, well, touch versus beyond touch, right? I'm guessing that for some of you, when I identified the beyond touch list earlier in this webinar, you went, oh, yeah, I didn't even think of that. I just was thinking touch. Why would you do touch? Okay, well, it's broadly understood by the public. We talked about that. Pretty much everybody's comfortable with the paradigm. Hardware is fairly commoditized these days. They're not giving it away, like candy, but the prices are way down. It's easy to scale, lots of different options, lots of different technologies. There's no shortage. The use cases are infinite. I mean, there's tons of things you can do with a touch screen. There's really no limit there. It is environmentally unaware, though. And what I mean is, it knows somebody's tapping the screen, but if all it knows is the tap, it doesn't know who the person is. It may not know where it is. It doesn't have any of the context, right? Let me give you some real examples in the Beyond Touch column to kind of make plain what I mean. In retail, maybe a lift and learn scenario where I pick up a shoe and then the digital screen shows me information about the shoe, facilitated through RFID. Or gender-based marketing where I'm using face detection. We've talked about this, so that it's showing me the relevant marketing programs for 30-year-old men, because that's what the camera thinks I am. In museums, maybe it's a voice-activated and voice-driven exhibit, which is, to help you accommodate the accessibility needs of people that maybe don't see very well, maybe they can't reach the screen. Or maybe it's just a cool exhibit where you're putting things on a table and the screen can see what you put on the table. And, oh, that's a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and oh, that's a Stegosaurus. And that's using tangible object technology, another type of interaction. See what I mean by not environmentally aware when it's just fingertips on a screen? It's not a criticism. It just may not really amp up the exhibit or the display or the sign or the training the way you want it to be. From a sales perspective, endless aisle kiosks where you're seeing products they're not in stock. So you want to enable your customers to take that product away with them on their phone. What the beauty of QR codes. Or maybe you just want to attract attention. One of the things that I've seen in my days at the mall is that sometimes you don't even know if a screen is interactive. You have no idea it's there to be interacted with. You need to recognize that you kind of have to promote it. You have to announce that fact, like attract loops. Videos and audio that exist to say, hey, come on over. I'm kind of interesting. You might want to play with me. And that could be triggered by a sensor, like for motion detection. So touch isn't bad. And in fact, I'm not saying it's an either or. I'm saying that depending on how ambitious you want to be and the story you want to tell and the objectives you want to achieve and the data you want to measure, touch may be insufficient. And there's all these other ways of interaction that can be incorporated to really ramp up the effectiveness of that deployment. You should keep all of those things in mind when you think about the kind of project you want to do to make sure it's the right project for interactivity. Okay, that's number one. Number two, location and demographics. There's lots of questions you need to ask yourself before you design this thing, before you invest in the hardware, before you decide where to put it. So location, think about where you're going to put it. Is it a quiet environment or is it a loud environment? That makes a big difference, right? Did you want to have audio? Well, then you need to make sure that this is in a location where it can be easily heard. Is it going to be in a loud place? Skip the audio. But did you think about that as you first thought about the design? You need to consider this. How public or private will the location be? If it's some sort of kiosk where I can buy stuff, it better be private because I'm putting credit card information in there. I'm putting my name. Maybe I'm typing my email address. It has to be private. Now, that might mean the location. It might mean the structure of the kiosk. You know, maybe it's table mounted, or there's a curtain, or there's privacy screens, or who knows, right? If it's public, oh, by the way, if it's private, maybe it needs to be a small screen, right? You don't want a 64-inch display with somebody tapping in the credit card number. But if it's public, maybe you want to go out of your way to make it big because that attracts other people and it sort of acts as its own advertisement. How crowded or intimate will that location be? Do you anticipate more than one user at that screen? Do you want to accommodate more than one interactor at the same time? If you want to prevent that, what would you need to do to prevent it? How intimate does it need to be? These are design considerations. Is it a time-limited interaction, or you want people to stay there forever? Do you want to put a timer on there? Do you want to sort of encourage calls to action quickly, or they can stand there all day? And what's good for the business and what's not good for the business? And is it an abusive environment? Meaning, is it going to get hurt by the weather? Is it a children's museum where it's going to be sneezed on and slapped and punched and bumped into? You got to think about these things, right? And you really need to think about them as soon as you can to make sure you're investing properly. On the demographic side, age is an obvious one. If it's going to be in a retirement home of some kind, you need to be much more modest in the types of interactivity you adopt and how you educate the user to partake of that particular sign versus something going into, I don't know, Dave and Buster's and, sky's the limit. It's a loud environment. It's not very private. It's going to be crowded, right? So you got those considerations for Dave & Buster's. But type of interactivity could be pretty adventurous, I guess. Sensitivity to personalization. Just because you can personalize it doesn't mean you should. Some people might be freaked out by it. They might be surprised you're able to do it. They might be hesitant to participate. So you need to think about, is your audience leaning one way or the other? Can you anticipate anything? You might have to build that into your design. And then accessibility, we've talked about this. You need to consider this early and upfront. Do you have a requirement to comply with Section 508 in the U.S. or whatever it's called overseas? Forgive me, I don't know. Is it just a nice to have, or you don't have to worry about it? Believe me, most deployments don't give tons of thought to this, which is probably a shame. But the fact is it's true. But you need to think about it up front. And I'm going to jump all over accessibility in more detail in a little bit. Okay, so location and demographics. There's so much to consider here before you make that transition, because a lot of these things just had no relevance to traditional deployments. It just didn't really impact it too much. And now it does because you're introducing interactivity. Privacy and security. There's reams of conversations and books and articles about privacy and security, and a lot of them, there's even niche fields like PCI for credit card processing. There's all of these rules and regulations. Let me just stick to the really big elephant in the room right now, which is GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It applies to, technically, it applies just to EU member states, but it really affects anyone doing business in the EU. So even if you're not, headquartered there, and maybe you don't even do 95% of your business there. If you do any business there, you're still required to respect and obey the rules governed by GDPR. I like GDPR. I think it's a good idea, but I like it's a real nutshell way of thinking about privacy and security, and I've boiled it down to 4 basic rules. You must think about these things when you're building your interactive kiosk. You cannot avoid this because you are liable for really nasty problems if you don't. Okay? Rule number 1, get permission first. You can't do anything with anybody's data unless you get permission first. Okay? It has to be explicit, not an asterisk with little tiny, fonts. No. You have to very explicitly, clearly, unambiguously get permission to use data, access data, process data. 2, you must delete data upon request. In other words, yeah, it's your server, and your server has my data, but that's not your data. That's my data. You're just holding it for me. And anytime I don't want you to have that data, you got to get rid of it. You got to take it off. So companies don't own the data. It's owned by the person whose data that describes. Third, stored data must be protected. This is not a crazy rule, right? If you're going to store it, you got to protect it so people can get their hands on it. And then third, as much as possible, you need to process locally. What you're trying to do is reduce the number of steps that are wrapping their hands around that data. And just the fact of putting it on the network is adding additional risk. And so the more you can process locally, the better, to minimize the amount of data that goes into the cloud, that is processed in the cloud, and that's stored in the cloud. Keep it local. It also makes it easier to delete, doesn't it? Because it's not going anywhere. It's only on the local system. So I like GDPR. It's a nice, broad-based umbrella way of thinking about your responsibility when introducing interactivity and particularly personalization. You got to think about these things. Is this interesting? Can you tell I like this stuff? 4, accessibility. So let's go a little deeper here. Making content accessible to anyone with a physical impairment. And as I said before, it could just be you're colorblind or you don't see very well. It doesn't have to be major physical complications. There's a huge spectrum of concerns. And I think that broadly we can think about it in 2 different ways. The type of interactions that can accommodate accessibility and some design best practices and considerations you should make for accessibility. On the interaction side, maybe people can't reach the screen. Maybe they can't see the screen. And that's something to consider, by the way, is how high you mount the screen, right? If somebody's in a wheelchair and your screen is way the heck up there, you got a problem. So anyway, text-to-speech is a very interesting approach to accommodating accessibility in an interactive way, where maybe I can't see the screen very well, but the screen's talking to me, so it's just as well. Voice activation, sort of the flip side, right? I'm talking to the screen. Next scene, previous scene, play the video, turn the page. Why not? Keyboard events. I don't want to, I almost said a bad word. I don't want to say bad things about keyboards. We're not trying to get rid of keyboards with all this cool interactivity stuff. And in fact, from an accessibility perspective, maybe you need a keyboard, right? If people can't reach the screen, they're not tapping on the virtual keyboard, or maybe they're just using the keyboard to say next slide, previous slide, play the video. Maybe they're just buttons mapped to the keys, right? So it's something to consider. Gesture is another one. Gesture could be sort of spatial gestures, or it could be gestures on the screen itself, just circles and swirls and things that don't have to be pinpoint. And that's the point. The point is I don't have to be able to put my finger on that little tiny button in the bottom right-hand corner. I can just do these broad gestures and it's good enough, right? So these are the kind of things you might want to consider from an interaction perspective. On the design side, I mentioned colorblind, for example, right? Or maybe I just don't see particularly well, but I can see, well, the size of words. The colors used. Use colors that statistically will accommodate even those with color blindness. The complexity of interaction. If it's a 5-step interaction process where I have to really fine-tune my finger pointing, that's not going to work for some of your audience. You need to consider that. Or maybe give people more than one way to achieve the same goal, like pushing the button on the keyboard to play a video, right? It's a secondary control. Neither control is better than the other. There's just more than one. So there's a lot more we can discuss. This is not a primer. This webinar is not just a primer on accessibility. So there's lots of other things to think of. But my goal was to put it in mind and make sure that it's something you're considering. How important is it for your audience, and what considerations do you need to make? 5, design influencers. So when you're thinking specifically about interactivity, how will that influence design? What do you need to keep in mind? Well, on the physical side, the device size and the operating system. There's lots of choices. Things like, is it a 3-screen, multi-screen display wall? Should it be a 1-screen kiosk? Should it be a mobile tablet? Should it be a tablet mounted to a kiosk? What size screen is appropriate? There are cost considerations for operating systems, also some scalability considerations. Do you want people playing 4 videos at the same time? Okay, then you're not using a Raspberry Pi to do that, But so these these are considerations before you decide what kind of interactivity you want. The mount, as I said, is it better as a table? Tables are great because you can have people around at 360 degrees. That might be perfect for a museum exhibition. Is it going to be wall mounted where you're sort of limiting the amount of interaction, but it's visible everywhere? Tables can be stood around, but nobody can see it from a distance. Do you want a freestanding kiosk, a wall mounted kiosk? Does it need to be mobile? Does it need to be mobile but limited so it's chained somehow? You need to think about these things. Secondary signage. Do you need to indicate that there's a sign over here? I've seen this a lot where I told you where content is interactive, you don't know it's interactive and it's hard to find. Or it's table mounted, you just don't know and you didn't look. Do you need secondary signage to help people understand what they need to do? Floor height, a lot of this is about accessibility, but it's also about, is it a children's museum or what? And, how high does it need to be? Sure, there are going to be chairs around it, and how many people are going to access it? And, if it's too high, you don't have to be in a wheelchair. You just have to be kind of short. You still can't reach it. And then online and offline. Are you going to be an environment where you can, for example, redeploy content because you need to make a change? Right? If it's an offline environment, first of all, the runtime needs to accommodate offline environments, but it also changes your considerations about information deployment and content updates. On the visual side, you need to provide guidance. Don't assume people know what they're supposed to do when they look at the screen. Tap here, rotate this, swipe that. Maybe you got to use some pictures to do that. Ideally, you have a set of menus. This is a choose your own adventure kind of thing, right? When it's interactive, people are defining their own path. They can get lost. So it's incumbent on you to make sure that there are menus that help them get back to where they're going, clear navigation options to help them navigate to move through the content. Content spacing, it's an interesting one. It's one of the reasons why web pages can be lousy content for interactivity. It's too cramped. You got these little tiny links wrapped in text, and you're trying to take your finger and touch the tiny little link, Content spacing is a big deal. If you're building something for a 64-inch display and a 12-inch iPad, is it going to be the same layout? Probably not, actually. You've only got 12 inches. You've got maybe even more pixels on the iPad, but physically it's 12 inches. How much stuff can you cram in there before fat fingers, can't access the right stuff? And then environmental aesthetics. Is it outdoors or is it indoors? Is it high class? Is it low class? And so this is about the aesthetics of not just the design, but even the housing, the infrastructure, the mount. I mean, all of these things are influencers. You got to think about it up front. Right? Personalization. So there are 3 classes of data. That's what I want to focus on here. Is that we keep talking about personalizing. What do you need to consider with the notion of personalization? What kind of information? What kind of process? So look, first it's user identification. Now that could be done in a lot of different ways. Some of it passive, some of it active. RFID, NFC, maybe they have a badge and they swipe a badge, right? So they're actively identifying themselves through the badge swipe. Maybe they log in. Maybe they literally identify themselves by typing into a keyboard. Who knows? Or maybe face detection, which is passive. They didn't have actively said, look at me, just the camera kind of gets a sense of who it is. That's identification at a non-personal level. So they don't know it's Jeff, but they know it's a guy who's in his late 40s but looks like he's in his 20s. That's just my opinion. So the first step to personalization is, okay, who's the person? To some extent, who's the person? Then you need to identify all the other contexts that you think will be relevant to that personalization. Like the location in the building or which city the building is in, or whatever that needs, what country it's in, the weather outside, maybe it's the date and time, maybe it's the sports scores, maybe it's the movie in the movie theater, maybe it's the latest news. I don't know, but there's probably some context that will influence the way you personalize. Okay? So it's whatever else you think matters. If you combine the user identification with context, you know a lot about that moment in time, and that can help determine what information you're showing, right? When you retrieve that information, it's influenced by who they are and the context. The data might be coming from local storage, or it might be coming from the cloud. It's probably local if you're offline. Ideally, it's not local if you're online, because If you're online, you can rapidly change that cloud-hosted data store so it's always up to date. Right? If it's offline, you better hope the information there is relevant. So the notion of personalization, you need to consider how you're going to know who they are, what information you need to understand about their context, and then what information you're going to retrieve as a result. So the simple idea I gave you before is there's a camera on my end on this retail kiosk. It sees I'm a 40-something guy. It knows it's snowing outside, so it retrieves information relevant for a 40-year-old guy on a wintry day. Right? But you can take that as far as you want. They could know exactly who I am and my purchase history. And last winter, you bought this shirt, or whatever. You can take it as far as you want. Got to consider these things when you make the jump to interactivity. Analytics. Number 7, collecting and analyzing data to develop actionable design, operational, and business insight. Actionable. It's easy to collect data. It's a lot harder to collect actionable data, right? You can swim in data. That's easy. Being able to work your way through that data to mine it for something useful and actionable, that's tough, okay? There are 5 steps to doing this. So this is just a high-level, quick little primer on the things you need to consider if you're thinking about analytics. First, you identify the objective, okay? Then you need to define the right key performance indicators that will indicate how well you're achieving those objectives. You then need to collect the data for those KPIs to keep track of how well you're doing against those objectives. You need to visualize that data in a meaningful way. Having just a bunch of numbers in a spreadsheet is not going to answer a question. So you need to visualize it appropriately and then act on the insight. Do something with it. Maybe you need to move the kiosk to a better location. It's too low traffic. Or maybe nobody's using it at all. We got to get a new exhibit. Or maybe this is working really well. We should roll it out to other kiosks. Or we collected a bunch of email addresses. Let's run a campaign or whatever it is. These are the 5 steps. What's the objective? How am I going to measure them? Measure them, visualize what I measured, and then act on that insight. That's analytics in a nutshell. The beauty of interactivity, you got stuff to measure. I said in the previous slide that objectives are smart. Good objectives are smart. Specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, time-bound. If you Google objectives for analytics, there's lots of other ways to slice and dice. This is the one that I like. They need to be specific, means you know exactly what it is. It's not ambiguous. You know exactly what it's about. There's absolutely something you can measure. Somebody owns it. It's assignable. Somebody's responsible for that. It's realistic. You know, it's not some insane objective that, let's be honest, never going to happen. And put a time on it. You know, it's a go, no go. We're like, you know what? It's been 6 months. This ain't happening. We need to do something else. Those are good objectives. What do we mean by insight, actionable insight? There's 4 kinds of insight. Descriptive, so it just describes the state of affairs. Diagnostic, it implies what the problem is. Predictive, it thinks this is what's going to happen. Prescriptive, it tells you what you need to do next, okay? As you work from the top to the bottom of this list, it gets harder, right? Prescriptive is tough. That's where some AI engine is looking at data and saying, you know what I think you should do? That's tough, right? But these are the 4 classes of insight. At the very least, descriptive and diagnostic should be on your plate. Understanding the state of affairs today and getting a good sense of why things are the way they are today. Then it's your job to decide maybe where it's going and how to be prescriptive. I wanted to refer back with this last bit about data. It fits into 3 categories. So what did they do, who are they are, and what's the context? So I'm just reiterating this point about the importance of context. But because it's interaction, what did they do? Who are they? What's the context? If you have that data, there's a ton of things you can do. Last topic, last consideration is the implementation approach. Moving left to right. You can be some crazy C# team banging away, absolutely works. Not a ton of skills out there, can be expensive, can take a while, but sky's the limit. You can build literally anything you want that's, well, at least, you know, achievable through code. HTML5 coding, we're up a level, it's still coding, but not so nuts There's a lot of interactive capability. You're on the web, which can be nice depending on what your deployment needs. Still not super agile because at the end of the day, it's still coding, but it adds some abstraction layers, which is nice. Then you have website builders. Now, this is specifically to websites, but there are types of interaction where you can tap things, for example, right? And they make life a lot easier. They're limited in what they can do. I don't know if I'm building an endless aisle interactive kiosk with payment processing with a website builder, but you get the idea that there might be a lot of scenarios where the website built explicitly for interactivity, where you have interactive design needs in mind, but it's a website. You could do that with these website builders. Then there's applications explicitly for interactivity. They're template driven. You buy the museum exhibition template, or the video carousel template. And there's a library of templates, and you can pay for professional services to customize those templates. So it's very agile, super quick. They tend to look really nice. Of course, the handicap is, unless you're paying a lot of extra money, it looks like other people's use of the template. There's some similarity there. So you're kind of constrained to what the templates allow, and there's not a lot of design freedom. And I don't know why this goes from low to high. Somehow Intuiface ended up at the top of this. I'm not sure how. But I will say that Intuiface exists to enable any team of any skill set to create interactive digital signage without writing code. And that includes any kind of interaction, including RFID NFC and speech recognition and the Internet of Things and sensors and even things like web APIs for data connectivity and data-driven signage. All of that is accessible without coding under the Intuiface umbrella. And that ultimately is our mission with Intuiface, is to enable any team to accommodate all these considerations we discussed and deliver something in a tenth of the time and for a tenth of the cost. So if any of you are interested, certainly I encourage you to take a look and see for yourself. So those are the 8 considerations. I just want to quickly wrap this up with a brief conclusion. If you look at the landscape of interactivity, this is for you agencies and integrators out there. I mentioned this way at the beginning. There's a lot of interactivity. We've got some data. This goes back to 2017, so it's a little old, which means this number is probably bigger, which is at least $500 million opportunity. The CAGR, the projected growth rate, is much more significant than this. This is a snapshot of the current opportunity, not where it's going. Why is there such a big opportunity? Because people are starting to realize there are other ways to tell this story, to teach this lesson, to sell a product, to educate an audience, to do whatever one can do with interactivity in any vertical you can think of. People are starting to recognize that, hey, there's a better way to do it. And so the significant opportunity exists, and it exists everywhere. So the way this chart works is the y-axis is the wow factor, and the x-axis is the volume, right? So a trade show, you might want super wow, but it's 3 screens. If this is some sort of digital sign telling me when the train is going to arrive, the wow factor might need to be kind of low. You're dealing with multiple ages, multiple demographics, multiple levels of comfort with interactivity, but tons of screens, right? So there's a spectrum of wow factor versus volume, and you guys everywhere, whether you're building this stuff for your own sales and marketing teams, for your own museum, your own library, your own real estate office, or you're an agency or integrator, you're somewhere on this spectrum, and in all cases, I think you can effectively incorporate interactivity if you give serious thought to the considerations we just discussed. I'm going to wrap this up with one more poll. So, after everything we've discussed, hopefully you've had a chance to think about this a little bit more. Over the next 3 years, do you plan to increase the number of projects using interactivity? Is it something you think you'd like to do? Okay. I didn't want to just say yes or no because none of you are here to say no. So the idea is sort of the percentage of your projects now. Like it was 25% today, but it's going to be 75%. So I'd love that insight a little bit. And I'll just give you 5 more seconds because I want to let you ask some questions. So I'll give you 5 more seconds. 2. That feels nice. Thanks for answering, guys. So good. So it looks like we're going to get a nice level of increase. I don't care ultimately. Well, I guess I care selfishly, but the point is interactivity, not how you do it or how you get there, but to do it right. To give it a good reputation and encourage people to look for it in other places as well. This rising tide will float all of our boats. As more and more of us do interactivity well, our audiences, us, will be more likely to want to do it again in the future with others, right? I want to thank everyone for your time and attention. I want to turn this over to Bradley because I'm hopeful there's some questions we can answer live.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeff, for that presentation. So our first question is which interactive options are the most effective?
My guess is that you've taken away from this webinar that the answer is my favorite answer. It depends, right? Because, well, what is your objective? What are you trying to achieve? Who is the audience? And what's your budget even, right? I think in terms of the ability to encourage rapid adoption, you'd stick with touch, right? Because everybody understands touch. So if you just want people to do stuff, touch is probably the lowest barrier. But when you want better engagement and better conversion, you might need to go further, like in retail, for example, with the lift and learn scenario. Now you're having people touch and feel and put the shoe in their hand and smell it and do all, and that will improve their level of engagement with the product. You're giving them information on the screen that could be more effective, right? So it's an it depends option. What I hope I was able to do is help you understand that there's more than just touch to consider, right? Okay, Bradley.
Excellent, thank you. So our next question is, how long does it take to put together a project that includes interactivity?
Certainly that depends on the implementation option you choose, right? The more the product enables sort of no coding approaches could be quicker. By the way, just because it's quick doesn't mean it's good. I can tell you with our own software, with IntuiFace, some of our customers, super skilled with IntuiFace, lousy aesthetics, right? So it's interactive, but it doesn't look very good, which means it still may not be very successful. So quick isn't better unless it's also effective, unless it's also good. But I would argue it's along that spectrum. If it's bespoke development, you figure well, it depends on the project, but maybe it's orders of magnitude, that if you're doing coding, it's probably 3 to 5 times longer than templates, and that might be 2 or 3 times shorter than HTML coding, or So I would keep that slide in mind and just sort of as a relative multiple of time, and treat it that way.
Excellent.
Bradley.
So our next question is, what are some good metrics to collect for analytics?
It's a good question, and it's a challenging one. I said that might be the hardest thing you do, is to figure out what to measure, because you might have a set of objectives, but no clear way to track how well you're achieving them. What I would say is this: you need to seriously consider your ability to measure dwell time and number of sessions, number of users, okay? The nice thing about that is it tells you which kiosks are seeing the most action. Maybe some locations are bad and some locations are really good. It tells you how effective the content is broadly, and that's through dwell time, how long people stand there. If 50 people use your kiosk and their average dwell time is 5 seconds, that feels pretty bad. Now, maybe you only want them there for 5 seconds. I guess it's possible. But by counting sessions, you understand traffic, you understand location effectiveness. By tracking dwell time, you understand the effectiveness of the material, the stickiness of that material, right? And then we start getting down to the particulars of your objectives. Was the objective to have them buy something? Well, now you know what to measure. Was the objective to have them watch videos? Now you have something to measure. So the objectives will determine the other sort of must-have metrics. But I think for sure, number of sessions and dwell time are pretty universal. They're going to give you a lot of insight about the broader success of that deployment. Bradley.
Excellent. So our next question is actually a request. So it's asking, would you consider creating a webinar tutorial on how to apply and create some of the Beyond Touch interactive possibilities?
Yes. Next question. Sure. I think so. I mean, that's 20 more webinars, right? I mean, there's a lot of options
Oh, yeah.
there. Certainly, I would be biased by our own platform and how we tackle them. Writing code to work with a facial detection technology would be different than using my platform, for example. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but conceptually, yes. I'm also a member of the Digital Signage Federation, DSF, and I know that we're collectively working on a set of educational modules there. My personal goal is to try to move in this direction as well to help better shine a light on interactive options and what it would mean to work with them. So stay tuned. We'll see. Bradley.
Excellent. So our next question is about your platform. It's asking, is Intuiface scalable to develop and manage bank lobby kiosk for 2,500 locations?
It is because, in a way, the number of locations doesn't matter. I mean, each location is independent of each other. We can certainly handle deployment to that number of screens. From a data-driven perspective, we're talking really about cloud technology. We don't have our own content management system. You're just using the data storage and the business logic accessible through web APIs. That's your infrastructure, not ours. And so conceptually, it could be 25, 250, 2,500, 25,000. It shouldn't matter. Yeah. Brett.
Excellent. So our next question is there a tutorial on RFID integration?
Look, if you Google, I'm sure you could Google tons of tutorials about how RFID works and how you might use it. Again, from an implementation perspective, from a real-world perspective, it's going to depend on the implementation approach you prefer, right? If you're going to write code or if you're going to do some third-party plugin, or maybe it's my platform, but whatever it is, it's going to vary. My advice is to first get comfortable with the concept, because that's going to give you a good sense if it's relevant for your environment or not. And then the next step after that would be, yeah, you like the ideas, then to start thinking up implementation approaches and talking to the vendors, I think. Bradley.
Excellent. So our last question for today is, which is the sector with the greatest growth in adopting digital signage?
Well, that says digital signage. I'm going to guess you mean interactive digital signage. Digital signage, broadly speaking, is an enormously healthy marketplace that Bradley certainly can attest to, and DOOH in particular, the out-of-home signage, it's still exploding. From an interactive perspective, a lot of it is in retail and museums. And the reason is because they've already been trying to do it anyway. So this is our perspective, okay? This is not good or bad, but it's our perspective. Museums, of course, they've been, you go to your local museum, you're still probably finding a Windows 95, PC driving some sort of big button exhibit. So they've been there for a long time, and they're always trying to find better ways to bring people back. It's another rising tide industry. One museum is effective. It helps drive traffic to other museums as well. So we see tons of pickup in that world, but retail as well. And I mean retail very broadly. That could be in-store, but maybe I should say sales. Let me not just say retail, because there's a mobile sales forces out there walking around with maybe an iPad where they're doing sort of assisted selling, where they're kind of working on the screen together, or it's a trade show. Tons of trade show use of interactivity to kind of give people an incentive to stay around in the booth, and maybe just self-service, right? You have 3 people working the booth, but you got 10 people being served because 7 are doing some self-service thing through interactivity. So I'd say sales/retail and museums. Broadly speaking, what is it? What's that acronym? Libraries, archives, museums, and there's another one in there. I forget the acronym, but sort of all these industries oriented around education and culture and that sort of thing. We see a lot of interest there. But it's all over. It's all over. And so I wouldn't go beyond picking on any others. They're all getting bigger, I think. Bradley, any others?
No, that looks like we're done with questions today. I want to remind everyone if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact Jeff. And also stay tuned. We will be posting this webinar on Digital Signage Today soon. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Bradley.